All right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another edition of On the Whistle. Now, as promised, this one's going to be a little bit different, not your usual Q&A format. We're going to be having a little bit of a deep dive into the African Cup of Nations. Now, a huge talking point. Pretty much every Sunderland fan I've spoken to or spent time with over the summer has just been absolutely thrilled, absolutely ecstatic with Sunderland's transfer business. But the two questions that keep coming up, or the two concerns, if you like, are one, is this spending sensible? Can we afford it? And two, what about AFCON? Now, the first one I'm going to address in a separate video and a separate piece later in the week, or possibly start next week, so keep an eye out for that. But today we're going to be talking about AFCON, something there's been so much conjecture, so much discussion about. So I actually thought it would be really interesting, even if some of it's a little bit boring in terms of going through dates and what have you, actually just breaking down what this is actually going to look like for Sunderland and how much this is actually going to impact their season. So this obvious starting point is who is actually going to be going to the African Cup of Nations later this year. So by my calculations, I'm expecting 7 of Sunderland's summer signings and current squad to go to the African Cup of Nations. I'll run through them now. So we've got Habib Diarra for Senegal, Noah Siddiqui and Arthur Masuaki, who both represent the Democratic Republic of Congo, Reynaldo Mandava, who plays for Mozambique, Simon Adingra for the Ivory Coast, Shamsdeen Talbi for Morocco, and deadline day signing Bertrand Traore for Burkina Faso. All of those countries have qualified. The lineup for the African Cup of Nations is confirmed and complete. All of those nations are taking part. Now, I've starred Shamsdeen Talbi because Shamsdeen Talbi hasn't actually been capped by Morocco yet, but he has declared to represent them. Now, he has been named in their most recent squad for the current international break, where there's some World Cup qualifiers happening. And I'm working on the assumption that given that he's in this squad, and by the time the tournament rolls around, he'll have another couple of months of Premier League experience under his belt. I think there's a very good chance that Talbi will be named in the Morocco squad. Now, that is, of all the 7, that is the biggest question mark. The rest, I would suggest, are pretty much nailed on to go and represent their countries. But with Talbi, there is a little bit of a question mark, so that's one to watch. But I think for the purposes of this video, I think it's probably best to assume that Talbi will be going. So when does the African Cup of Nations actually happen? And perhaps most importantly, how many of Sunderland's Premier League games does it encompass? So the African Cup of Nations is starting a little bit earlier this year than what you might traditionally be used to. That's for a number of factors. I think primarily the Club World Cup and the effect that's had on the calendar, I think, is a big part of this, but also the extension of the Champions League, some other factors in this. So the group stage takes place from December the 21st, that's of this year, December the 21st, 2025, and runs right through till New Year's Eve. We then go into a round of 16, which runs from January the 3rd to the 6th. Quarterfinals take place on January the 9th and 10th. Semi-final on January the 14th, and then we have the third versus fourth place playoff and the final on January the 17th and the 18th. Now, I think there's a really important point to make here is that it's a 24-team tournament, and obviously 16 teams go through to the knockout stages. So how that basically works is the top 2 teams from each of the 6 groups go through, but we also see 4 of the best third place finishers in the group go through. So there's only going to be 8 teams knocked out at the end of the group stage. So I think that when we're looking at how long Sunderland are going to be missing players for, I think it's safe to assume the vast majority of these players are going to be going until at least the round of 16, which runs from January 3rd to the 6th. Now, that's not nailed on. It might be that 1 or 2 of these nations get knocked out in the group stages. But given the fact that, as I said, 3/4 of the teams go through, I think it would be safe to assume that we're probably looking at the first week of January before any of Sunderland's players are back and prepared and ready to play for Sunderland. So what does Sunderland's fixture list actually look like during this time? So I would envisage, given that the group stage starts on December 21st, that most of these players are going to depart after the derby against Newcastle United at home at the Stadium of Light on December the 13th. Sunderland then play Brighton away on December the 20th, Leeds United at home on December the 27th, Man City at home on December 30th. Now, with the group stage running until New Year's Eve, I think it's pretty much nailed on. It's Sunderland are going to lose all 7 of those players, providing Talbi gets called up, of course, for those 3 games. So I think we're looking at, for sure, 3 games where Sunderland are going to be without all those players. Spurs on January the 3rd looks really, really, really tight, even for anybody who gets knocked out in the group stage. Brentford on January the 7th, a possibility for anyone who gets knocked out in the group stage, but both of those games will come too soon for anyone who makes it to the round of 16. So if any team makes it to the round of 16, think it's highly likely that they're going to be missing 5 Sunderland Premier League games. There's then an FA Cup third round, is the weekend following that. So that would be a game that potentially anyone who gets knocked out before the end of the quarterfinals could feature in. And then Sunderland are at home to Crystal Palace on January the 17th. If any players make it to the semi-finals, which take place on the 14th, I suppose there's a possibility they could come back and be involved in that game, but obviously it would be super tight. Anybody, in fact, that's complete nonsense because there's a 3rd and 4th place finish. So anyone who gets to the last 4 will also miss that Crystal Palace game because that 3rd and 4th place playoff and the final takes place on January the 17th and the 18th. So if anybody gets to the semi-finals out of these Sunderland players, they're going to miss 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 Premier League games and the FA Cup third round. So there's absolutely no doubt that this is going to have a huge impact on Sunderland's season. I don't think there's any kind of way of getting around that. As I say, there is a chance that a handful of these players are only actually missing 3 games. That is obviously still a problem, but not anywhere near as severe. It's highly unlikely that all of these players are going to get to the last 4, and therefore we will see some coming home to play for Sunderland and potentially only missing sort of a handful of Premier League games. But there is definitely going to be a big impact on Sunderland's season. So what I wanted to finish by looking is going, well, okay, well, when these players go and if they're going to be missing for a period of time, how is this going to actually impact Sunderland's squad? Have they got the depth at the end of the transfer window to cover for this? And I think the answer is definitely yes in some positions and quite concerning in other positions. So if we look at the positions of the players who are actually going and playing in, now obviously there's going to be 2 left-backs going with Reynaldo and Arthur Masuaku. That's not ideal, but I would suggest that Sunderland do have the players to kind of cover for that, especially if it is only for 3 or 4 games. It's not ideal, but there are players in the squad who can cover. Hopefully, well, by this point, Dana Serkin and Adji Elise should be fully fit. Serkin and Elise are both expected back after the upcoming international break, so that gives them plenty of time to get fully up to match fitness by the time those games are around, and both those players will obviously be in contention. Leo Hjelde as well is expected back after the international break to offer some additional cover. But I think the beauty of Sunderland's recruitment this summer in defensive positions, which I think has been really, really strong, is that what they can also do is they do have the option to play Trey Hume at left back, which is something he's done a lot in his career, not ideal, but a position he's performed pretty well in. And of course, you could either play Nordi Mukele or Luciano Gertruida as the right back. And you should still, through a combination of Alderete, Dan Ballard, Luke O'Nien, you should still have enough players at centre half to cover for that. So defensively, it's not ideal, but I'm not overly concerned about that part of the pitch during AFCON, especially as I say, if some players do start to come back after after the group stages, all the round of 16. 2 centre midfielders are going in Habib Diarra and Noah Siddiqui. That is definitely an issue, not because Sunderland don't have players to come into the starting 11, but it is of course going to squeeze their options in terms of changing the game from the bench. So I think this is a massive opportunity clearly for Dan Neil and Chris Rigg. When those games come around and when Siddiqui and Diarra depart, there's going to be vacancies in front of Granit Xhaka in that midfield. And Sunderland, I think the plan will be that by that point, Neil and Rigg obviously had a disrupted pre-season, but should be fully fit by then and have quite a lot of minutes under his belt. Dan Neil obviously isn't in the team at the moment, but that is quite a long period of time away for him to adapt, for him to adjust, to get more experience of Premier League football so that he's actually ready to come into the team and hopefully make an impact. Clearly a big ask for both of them, and as I say, my concern is not so much with those 2 players, who I definitely think could do a job, but if you are looking at a 5-6 game stretch, you're putting an awful lot of a burden on a handful of midfield players to essentially play 90 minutes. Now, of course, Enzo Lefebvre is an option in centre midfield, a very, very, very strong option, but the biggest area of concern for me is definitely the wide areas, because Sunderland are potentially going to lose 3 wingers. They will almost definitely lose Simon Adingra and Bertrand Traore. And as I mentioned before, there's a very good chance they could also lose Shamsdeen Talbi. So that essentially only really leaves them with Romain Mundle in terms of a natural wide player. Mundle, we're expecting to be back from his hamstring injury in the middle of October. So by this point, you should be fully fit and competing for starts. That's obviously a big tick. However, beyond that, there's very, very little depth. There is depth outside of AFCON, but definitely not during AFCON. So that means that Lefebvre, I expect, will be required to play some minutes in the wide areas, as we've seen him do of late. And you're probably looking at using a combination of Wilson Easter and Eliza Mayenda, I think, in the wide areas to help cover for those absences. Now, that is definitely a position that I'm concerned about, not just in terms of the options from the start, but clearly in terms of the capacity for Lebris to rotate both from game to game and within games is going to be really challenging. So the last thing that I just wanted to kind of point out or discuss a little bit is, of course, international tournament, incredibly unpredictable. There'll be surprises, teams that are expected to do really well and flounder, and teams that aren't being backed at all who do really, really well. So it's a bit of a fool's game trying to predict how the tournament's going to go. But I just thought it was worth noting that if you look at the early bookies odds for this, Morocco, Ivory Coast and Senegal are heavily tipped. So that's, of course, Talbi, Diarra and Adingra. Democratic Republic of Congo had a really strong qualifying campaign, but not quite so much fancied at this point in terms of Siddiqui and Masuaku. Burkina Faso and Mozambique very much seen as two of the outsiders of the tournament. That, of course, includes Reynaldo and Bertrand Traoré. So if you're beginning to just look to see which players might be around for a while at this tournament, I think you're definitely looking at Ivory Coast and Adingra. They're the defending champions. Adingra is a key player. You really have to suggest that unless something goes wrong or something unexpected happens, Ivory Coast could be running pretty deep into January in terms of their AFCON campaign. And so you're potentially looking at Adingra missing quite a lot of games. Habib Diarra and possibly Talbi as well could be in that category. Now, there's every chance that the other nations, spring a surprise, as I say, and Siddiqui, Masuaku, Traoré, Reynaldo, they could be gone for a while. However, yeah, I think probably the ones that you're looking at this moment who you would really expect to go deep into the tournament would be Morocco, who are the hosts, Senegal and Ivory Coast. So it's going to be really interesting to see how that pans out. So in short, having done this little bit of research and having taken a closer look, am I reassured or more concerned? I think I'm probably slightly reassured. I think that Sunderland do have the options in the squad now at the end of the transfer deadline to come through this in most positions. I am worried about the wide areas because I think that, Bertrand Traoré is an excellent pickup, and from the research I've done, I think he could be a really impactful player. However, losing Robertson, bringing Traoré in, there is clearly one negative consequence, and that is it does further deplete Sunderland's wide options during the African Cup of Nations. So I don't think there's any doubt whatsoever that this is going to be a massive factor in Sunderland's season. It's going to be a huge test for Lebris and for the players who come in. There's no reason why they should define Sunderland's season. As I say, realistically, they're not going to be without all 7 players for all 6 of those Premier League games that I've mentioned. Realistically, they're probably going to be without 1 or 2 for all of those games, and they'll be without most of those players potentially for 3 or 4 of those games, which is obviously not ideal, but it's not something that is insurmountable either. So this is clearly going to be a massive factor in Sunderland's campaign. It's clearly going to have an impact on results, and I suspect it may cost them some points across the course of the campaign. But it was interesting speaking to Lebris in Portugal and speaking to Christian Speakman again this week, and then making the point that Sunderland needed quality. This is a 38-game season. Sunderland needed to add quality players, and these players fit the bill. And they'll be hoping that that the quality they've added to the group accrues enough points over the season that this run of games won't be sort of the difference between staying up or not. And also in terms of backing those players, in a lot of cases who we saw perform really, really strongly last year, after a bit more time that they'll have had by the time the AFCON comes around to adjust, to go out and make a really positive impact in those games. So I don't think we should be panicked about this, but I think it's definitely right to flag it up as something that's going to have a huge impact on Sunderland's season, that it's going to be quite tough to negotiate for a period of time. So there we go. I hope that wasn't too boring. I'm quite aware that long parts there I've just been reading data, which doesn't feel like particularly dynamic, forward-thinking video content, but it's just something there's been so much noise around. Thought it might be actually helpful to get the facts down. Now, I think there will be, by the time you watch this, there will be a written piece of all of this on the Sunderland Echo website, and that'll have all the dates and what have you written down. So if that's something that you think might be useful or helpful to see it all written down, to see the actual dates, then please head over to the Sunderland Echo website, because the article will be there. As ever, thanks for watching. As I said, I'm going to do a bit of a finance video, not that I'm in any way a financial expert, but just from what I've been hearing and the people I've been speaking to about in football, about some spending, and dig into those themes a bit more before all attention's turned to obviously the end of the international break and Crystal Palace. So as ever, thanks so much for watching.